7 years ago, I had truly no thoughts about cannibalism except for gross. And then I got a PhD in literature, and one of the unexpected side effects of that is that now I have all of these books on my shelf and thoughts in my brain about cannibalism in English literature of the 1500s and 1600s, and today I'm going to make that your problem. For a lot of years now, I've been reading 400-year-old plays in which people are doing cannibalism or talking about cannibalism. I've read poetry and prose about cannibalism. I read about the history of cannibalism. I read scholarship about the metaphorical implications of cannibalism. Turns out it's a really meaty subject, lots to sink your teeth into. So in this video today, I'm just gonna walk through a dozen or so plays that feature cannibalism and talk about how cannibalism factors into these plays, and what historical and literary scholarship contexts we can use to better understand the function of cannibalism in these plays. We're not going to talk about everything because I can't fit 7 years worth of research into one video, but we are going to talk about cannibalism and sex, cannibalism and race, cannibalism as metaphor for things like greed and violence. And then by the end of this video, I will not be alone in my cursed knowledge of cannibalism plays, because what is in my head will be in your head also. And so, let's dig in. We're going to start with the Shakespeare play that makes everyone say, "Oh no!" Titus Andronicus. This is one of Shakespeare's earliest plays. It was probably first performed in 1592, and it is famous for two things. Number one, containing a really classic your mom joke, and number two, containing a climactic final everyone dies scene centering around what we usually refer to as sun pie. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that basically every bad thing that one person could do to another person gets done to people in this play. Look up a full synopsis of this play at your own risk. Trigger warning for literally everything. For the more narrow purposes of this discussion of cannibalism, the context you need to know is that our title character, Titus, and his children are in conflict with a woman named Tamara and her children. And in the play's conclusion, Titus kills Tamara's two sons, who are named Cyrus and Demetrius. He bakes them into a pie, and then he feeds them to her. Sun pie. In Act 5, Scene 2, Titus has Chiron and Demetrius alone, and he is preparing to kill them. Don't worry, they really deserve it. And here is what he says to them. "You know your mother means to feast with me, and calls herself revenge, and thinks me mad. Hark, villains, I will grind your bones to dust, and with your blood and it I'll make a paste, and of the paste a coffin I will rear, and make two pasties of your shameful heads, and bid that strumpet, your unhallowed dam, like to the earth, swallow her own increase. This is the feast that I have bid her to, and this the banquet she shall surfeit on." Yeah. I'm a scholar of early modern English drama. I'm not a theater professional, not a performer. Okay, my diction maybe could use some work. But yeah, basically Titus is telling Chiron and Demetrius that he's going to grind their bones into flour, combine their bone flour with their own blood to make a pastry dough, turn that pastry dough into a pie shell, which was actually called a coffin at the time. The pie crust encasing of a pie was called a coffin, so that's convenient for Titus's creepy purposes. And then yeah, he's gonna make their mother eat their body, and he does do that. One of the things that I find interesting about that speech is that he's basically forcing Chiron and Demetrius to sit as an audience to their own post-mortem fate. He's making them confront not just their impending death, but this horrible thing that's going to happen to them after they've died. So that just, ramps up the horror another notch. But another interesting thing about this speech is that it's essentially a recipe. And there's one scholar whose work on this subject I really like, Sally Templeman, and she points out that this speech is, she calls it quasi-authentic, that the language used in this speech and that the process Titus is describing are actually pretty accurate to what you would find in an early modern English recipe book. Now, obviously, you would not find a recipe for sun pie in an early modern English cookbook, but Wendy Wall points out in her discussion of the violence inherent in early modern English domestic work that the animal and human body were not separated taxonomically in cookbooks, medical guides, or actual household spaces. You would, in fact, find the human body as an ingredient in early modern English recipes. Cookbooks as we know them now did not exist as a genre in early modern England. What you had instead were domestic guides, which would include instructions for dyeing linen, for getting stains out of cloth, and also culinary recipes, and also medical recipes. And many medical recipes of this time called for the human body as an ingredient in the form of things like feces and urine, and also blood and bone. So while, like I said, you would never see a recipe for sun pie that calls for grinding bones into flour and mixing them with blood to make a pastry shell, you would see blood and bone in cookbooks at the time. So one layer of understanding cannibalism in Titus is understanding that the human body as an ingredient was a familiar concept to audiences of the time. More on that later. We get to the final scene of this play. Titus is dressed as a cook because he's whimsical. He feeds Tamara the pie, then he reveals to her what was in the pie, then he kills her. Now what's interesting about this scene is, well, a lot of things, but one thing in particular that I want to talk about now is that between the moment when Titus reveals to Tamara what was in the pie and the moment when he kills her, she doesn't get any lines. She doesn't have any speech to react with. Because in plays of that time, there are very few stage directions that indicate physical movement or reaction, that leaves a degree of ambiguity about how Tamara would react in this moment. Obviously, we can assume horror, grief, disgust, things like that, but what specifically would Tamara do in that moment when she realizes that she has just eaten her children? Last year on my birthday, I went to go see a production of Titus at the Globe Theater because I make questionable choices. And this production of Titus presented this really, really compelling interpretation of that moment of silence on Tamara's part that I think about now every time I read this scene. The second half of the performance began with the cast singing this song that was basically a parable of a mother bunny, I think it was a bunny, who realizes that her children are vulnerable to predators and the dangers of the world. And so in order to try to protect them, she eats them to return them to the safety of her body, the way that they were contained within her when she was pregnant with them. And then when we got to the banquet scene in this performance, in the moment after Titus has revealed what was in the pie, but before he kills her, Tamara reacted by starting to eat more and kind of desperately cramming more and more of the pie into her mouth. And because we had that framing context of the song, that turned this moment into something where you could see Tamara wanting to protect her children and wanting to return them to her body. And so it shifted the cannibalism away, for me at least, from just straight horror, from just gross, into something a lot more interesting about how cannibalism collapses the borders between one body and another. Because even though cannibalism is horrifying and gross, it is this really rich opportunity for metaphor. And in this instance, there was the literal cannibalism happening, but there was also this invitation to consider cannibalism as this figurative way to express an irrational desire to incorporate somebody else's body into your own, to completely collapse those borders of distinctions between two people. Now let's turn our attention to another play in which a parent sits down at a table and is served the body of their child. This play is called Antonio's Revenge. It was written by Thomas Middleton and first performed in 1602. And let me just say, this has nothing to do with cannibalism, but I would like it out there for context that this play is a sequel to a romantic comedy. In 1601, Thomas Middleton writes Antonio and Melita, which is a romantic comedy that ends in the title characters getting engaged. 1 year later, you have the sequel. It is a revenge tragedy. Everybody dies. Like, imagine you go to see How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days 2, and then you end up just watching Matthew McConaughey going on a killing spree. So that first play, Antonio and Melita, had ended with the engagement feast of Antonio and Melita. Part 2 picks up right where that left off, the aftermath of the engagement feast, except Antonio's father has been murdered by Melita's father, Piero. And now Piero wants to marry Antonio's mother. Lots of things go down between the beginning and the end of this play. You have Antonio faking his own death, Melita actually dying of grief, Piero getting engaged to Antonio's mother, Antonio killing Piero's young son. The play's conclusion, once again, a violent everybody dies at the banquet scene, takes place at the engagement feast between Piero and Antonio's mother. Antonio and his friends dress up as performers. They do a little dance around the banqueting table, get Piero alone, hold him down in a chair, overpower him, bring out a banqueting dish, and uncover it to reveal the arranged limbs of Piero's son. And those limbs are not actually consumed. Piero is not forced to eat his child in the way that Tamara was, but the implication is pretty clear that this is meant to evoke horror at the prospect of cannibalism, at the possibility of Piero consuming his sons, at just the visual of a body being laid out on a banqueting table as if it is food. What's interesting about the way that cannibalism is presented in this play is that it's really drawing out this connection between an appetite for violence and an appetite for the body. Piero's excessive violence is presented as a kind of excessive appetite. And so Piero is confronted with this visual of his son's body on a plate, and he and the audience are confronted with this possibility that if murder consumes a life, consumes a human, is it not a kind of cannibalism? And now let's talk about another play in which cannibalism is evoked, but not necessarily enacted. And oh boy, what a play this is. This might really be the craziest play I have ever read. Get ready, it's time for John Ford's 1632, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore. There's a song on David Bowie's final posthumous album called 'Tis Pity She Was a Whore, and that always blows my mind because the idea of David Bowie reading this play is insane. This play is insane. Luckily, the David Bowie song has nothing to do with the actual contents of this play because this play is about star-crossed lovers. And the reason for their star-crossedness is that they're siblings. They're brother and sister. Giovanni and Annabella. Their names are Giovanni and Annabella. They are brother and sister, like full on, like Their names are Giovanni and Annabella. They are brother and sister. They fall in love. They make private marriage vows to each other. They consummate their marriage. She becomes pregnant. In order to hide her pregnancy, she marries another man named Soranzo. None of this goes well. The concluding everyone dies banquet scene of this play takes place at Soranzo's birthday feast. Giovanni feels that Annabella has betrayed him by marrying another man. And so while everyone else is feasting, Giovanni goes to Annabella, confronts her, kills her, carves out her heart, and then walks into the banquet scene with her heart kind of shish kebabbed on a dagger, waving it all around. Everyone says, "Hey, Giovanni, what are you doing? What's that?" And he says, "You came to feast, my lords, with dainty fare. I came to feast too, but I digged for food in a much richer mine than gold or stone of any value balanced. 'Tis a heart, my lords, in which mine is entombed, in which is mine entombed." I'm not an actor. Now, like with Titus, where there's some ambiguity about what Tamara is physically doing because of a lack of stage directions, there is room for interpretation in this scene because there is no indication necessarily that Giovanni munches on the heart, but there's no indication that he doesn't either, so it's kind of up to the interpretation of the person reading or staging the play. Maybe he takes a little nibble, maybe he's just waving it around. Anyway, everyone dies. But once again, in this scene, we have this spectacle of a person being rendered into something edible in this moment that is horrifying and shocking, but is also rich with potential metaphorical implications. Giovanni has this desire to completely erase the boundaries between his body and the body of another person, in this case, the woman he loves, his sister. But this iteration of that also brings in this element of Giovanni's desire to really possess her and control her and hold her heart in his hands. The way that love can consume you and the way that passion can feel like hunger is made disgustingly literal here. And with that, I'm going to transition, unfortunately, into the connections between cannibalistic hunger and sexual desire. I'm going to get something stronger than water for this one. Sometimes the bookshelf bourbon really comes in handy. Okay, so cannibalism and sex. We'll start with a play that uses only the language of cannibalism rather than actual acts of cannibalism to demonstrate sexual desire. This play is called The Insatiate Countess, first performed in 1607, written by multiple authors. My fun fact for this play is that the title character, the Countess Isabella, has one of the more substantial speaking roles for a female character in Jacobean drama. She delivers 500 and something lines throughout the duration of the play, and the character with the second highest amount of lines in the play only has 200 and something. So she really dominates this play. She talks to us a lot. She also takes a lot of lovers. The play's title, The Insatiate Countess, refers to the fact that the Countess Isabella, throughout the course of the play, is just kind of moving quickly from one relationship to another and is insatiably horny. Her lust is presented as a kind of hunger. And in fact, there are two different scenes in which a banquet features heavily into Isabella's seduction of her desired lover. The play is presenting this intertwining of physical and sexual hunger. Of this play and of this character, Wolfgang Mueller writes the following. The play's protagonist, the insatiate countess, actually is presented as a woman who devours men. If Isabella emerges in this play as a kind of sexual cannibal, a voracious sex maniac who uses men as fuel to her lust, her main strategy of temptation is to invite men to feed on the delicacies of her body. Thus, she promises her lover an erotic banquet. And of course, we don't need examples from 17th century literature or scholarly interpretation to understand how there can be this conceptual intertwining of food and sex. That connection is pretty well and pretty ubiquitously established. We're used to the language of food or of eating being used to describe sexual attraction or sexual acts. And we're used to the language of pleasure being applied to food and eating. And just to underline this, I want to take a brief scholarly detour from my focus on early modern English literature and read a little passage from Elspeth Probin's Carnal Appetites. This passage is from the introduction of a chapter called Eating Sex. Practices of preparing and eating food are of course highly sensual and sometimes sexual. Think about stuffing zucchini flowers with batons of cheese, rub alongside the full bursting stamen, and enfold the flower's organ, cheese with petal twisted. How to ignore that flash of power, that moment of confusion, when the cookbook instructs me to check whether the flowers are male or female, and not to use the latter. The more mundane stuffing of a chicken may bypass the question of its sex, but nonetheless intimately involves the cook thrusting her hands, covered in buttery crumbs, up the open orifice. You wouldn't use a spoon, would you? In more clinical fashion, cleaning squid necessitates sticking fingers into the unknown, drawing out the plastic-like backbone, feeling a sack of eggs, ink, or sometimes the remnants of its last dinner tickle the tips of the digits. God, she's a good writer. Food is sexy, sex is gustatory. We don't necessarily need scholarship to point that out, but it does sometimes help articulate it. But even in that passage out of Carnal Appetites, and even in The Insatiate Countess, this remains at the level of language and metaphor. Let's look at a play that makes it literal. The Bloody Banquet, probably written by Dekker and Middleton, probably first performed around 1608. And while the phrase Bloody Banquet could refer to most of the plays I've already discussed in this video, this one really takes it to new heights, or depths, possibly. Because in the concluding banquet scene of this play, a woman is forced to eat the body of her lover. In this play, we have a young queen married to a cruel tyrant, and the young queen falls in love with a young man named Timothes. She begins an affair with Timothes, and like the Countess Isabella, she seduces him using a banquet. When the tyrant discovers the affair, the young queen kills her lover because she knows that her husband is so cruel that he would inflict torture on him worse than death if he got his hands on Timothes. Specifically, the young queen tells Timothes, kneel down and pray, and then I'll be right back, because she wants him to have a last prayer so that his soul will be absolved and he'll be able to go to heaven. And while he is praying, she walks in with 2 pistols and she kills him. And the tyrant is very upset that she has managed to circumvent his torture plans and kill Timothes before he got his hands on him. But he decides that he won't go entirely without revenge. He's driven into this kind of jealous rage at the idea of the artful fetch, the whispering close disguising, the hour, the banquet, and the bawdy tapers. The sensuality of the banquet is part of what is so enraging to him about his wife's infidelity. So he orders for Timothes' body. Timothes. So he orders for Timothes' body. The tyrant orders for the body of the queen's lover to be quartered, like an animal being processed into meat. And he says to the young queen, "Lady, you see your cheer, fine flesh, coarse fare. Sweet was your lust, what can be bitter there? By heaven, no other food thy taste shall have, till in thy bowels those corpse find a grave, which to be sure of, come, I'll lock thee safe from the world's pity. Hang those quarters up, the bottom drinks the worst in pleasure's cup." And so, in a spectacle of violence which the scholar Gary Taylor compares to the woodchipper scene from Fargo, the banquet scene gives us Timothy's limbs strung up around the stage, hanging down, while a table is laid before the young queen, containing Timothy's body and bloody skull. And she is forced to consume him, with the parallel being made explicit that just as he entered her body through sex, now he will enter her body as food. So what have we seen about cannibalism and literature so far? We've seen unsettling parallels between culinary processing and a human body being rendered into food. Cannibalistic hunger as parallel to sexual desire. Cannibalism as a way to control and claim mastery over the body of another person. Cannibalism as a means to express the irrational desire to erase the borders between your body and another's and consume them and incorporate them within yourself. Cannibalism as commentary on the appetite for violence. And I've still really only scratched the surface. This is a first taste, if you will. We could talk about how in plays like Shakespeare's 1605 Timon of Athens or Richard Brome's 1630 The City Wit, the language of cannibalism is used to express a fear that the greed of false friends will consume you. We could dig in, as Wendy Wall does at length, to Thomas Heywood's 1627 The English Traveller, in which the prospect of a cannibalistic banquet is played for laughs. It's a point of comedy. Act 2, Scene 1 of this play, there is a clown character named Roger who is describing to a married couple a banquet he has just attended, and he's using comically misleading language that could apply either to human bodies or to animal bodies to trick them into thinking that he just witnessed a cannibalistic feast. He talks about people devouring breasts and legs and hands ripping into stomachs and brains. And this is, of course, just build up to a reveal that he's talking about animal bodies, and what he's describing is actually just a pretty normal banquet, and we get to laugh at that. And I often do make a joke of cannibalism in literature, or at least take it lightly, because some of these things are so over the top that you kind of have to laugh a little bit. And also, again, I've spent so many years reading these plays, I would go insane if I were really taking it 100% seriously and thinking about the reality of these acts all the time. But despite often taking it lightly or rolling my eyes at the more over-the-top elements of this, I think any discussion of cannibalism in early modern English literature is incomplete and possibly irresponsible without acknowledging that there is a darker reality underlining all of this. That reality being that cannibalism wasn't just a literary device in early modern England. It was a literal practice, and a literal practice with connections to some very real and very lasting forms of harm. Earlier, when I was talking about Titus, I mentioned that the human body was sometimes used as an ingredient, usually in medical recipes, in the form of blood, bone, or feces. But another common form that the human body as ingredient took was the form of mummy. And talking about this is going to bring us into talking about how cannibalism is connected to ideas of racial difference and of the figure of the other in early modern English thought and practice. Medical texts of the 17th century describe the uses and the tastes of mummified human bodies. In some of these texts, you will find reference to the idea that the highest quality mummy came out of Africa. You will also see recipes for how to make your own mummy. One recipe that was first written in 1609 and first translated into English in 1670 gives instructions for how to turn the body of an executed red-headed man into mummy. And one of the worst things I've ever read, a text published by Samuel Purchas in 1607, describes a process for taking an alive man, a captive Moor, carefully dieting him while he's alive, and then killing him and processing his body into mummy, which can then be consumed. With this particular text, I would say that whether or not that process was ever followed is secondary to the fact that it presents as acceptable and as legible to readers the idea of a person as an ingredient. The term more, of course, has a somewhat unstable definition in early modern English usage, but it is a racial identifier, and it's usually used to apply to people from Northern Africa. For most of us today, the most recognizable use of the word more is as a descriptor for Othello, the character from Shakespeare. And it's worth noting that there is reference to mummy and to cannibalism in the play Othello. The proof that finally drives Othello to believe that his wife Desdemona has been unfaithful to him is that she seems to have given away a handkerchief that he gave to her as a gift. And at one point, he describes this handkerchief as having been dyed in mummy, in this dark, pitch-like substance that was extracted from mummified bodies. And earlier in the play, when Othello is describing how he and Desdemona first fell in love, he recounts how he basically charmed her by relaying travel narratives, stories about his exotic adventures. One of these adventures is his encounters with cannibals. I used the phrase travel narrative there very intentionally because in the early 1600s and beyond, we see a lot of travel narratives that are based around sharing people's experiences of traveling to the New World, the Americas, and the people who they encountered there. And in many of these travel narratives, people describe having encountered cannibals. We understand cannibalism as this extreme taboo. It is a fundamental wrong that you just don't do, like murder or incest. Not a coincidence that I've talked about all three of those things in this video. And so because cannibalism is an absolute wrong, it can be used to dehumanize people, to paint them as barbaric or uncivilized. And that is how it is often presented in early modern travel narratives, but not always. In a chapter about cannibalism as a crime, one scholar describes the cannibal as a, quote, protean figure who on the one hand, quote, represents the primitive other, a savage member of a regressive society who stood in stark opposition to the progressive enterprise society of the Europeans, but on the other hand, and on a subconscious level that gradually emerged into the consciousness of at least some people, the New World cannibals were mere pussycats, and sometimes noble pussycats, in comparison to a newer and more vicious kind of cannibal, those rapacious colonialists, imperialists, and capitalists who literally devoured the peoples who stood in their way. I brought up earlier how the consumption of human life through murder can be framed as a kind of cannibalism. And what we see now is this tension between the idea of the savage cannibal and the understanding, however latent or however nascent, of how imperialism and colonial violence functions as a kind of cannibalistic consumption of the lives of others. And this brings us to another Shakespeare play. I started with one of his first, we're ending with one of his last, The Tempest. In The Tempest, we have Prospero, the former Duke of Milan, who has been exiled and has made his home on an island which was inhabited by magical beings who he has now forced into servitude of him and his daughter Miranda. One of the figures Prospero has forced into servitude is a character named Caliban. And obviously, just on a surface level, the name Caliban evokes the word cannibal. Caliban is a really complicated and intriguing figure in terms of how we interpret him, because he could either be read as non-human, as a supernatural creature. This is a play with magic and with fairies, and he could fall into that category, but he could also be interpreted as a non-white person, a human, whose humanity is simply being rejected by the European people with whom he is in contact with, and so he is being presented as a creature rather than a person, not because of who he is, but because of how he's being perceived. And that second interpretation of Caliban is the basis of this play, A Tempest, as opposed to Shakespeare's The Tempest. A Tempest was written in the 1960s by Martinican politician and writer Aimé Césaire, and it explicitly sets the action of the play in the colonial Caribbean and casts Caliban as an enslaved black man. I'm bringing up The Tempest and the context of colonial violence, not just because Caliban sounds like cannibal and it's set on an island that possibly is in the Caribbean or in the Americas, but because The Tempest gives us a rare moment of insight into what Shakespeare was reading. Act 2, Scene 1 of The Tempest contains a speech which directly paraphrases an essay that was first translated into English in 1603 and was written by Michel de Montaigne in 1580. And that essay is called Of Cannibals. In this essay of Cannibals, Michel de Montaigne is describing the cannibalistic practices of people indigenous to what is now Brazil. And he says that the literal cannibalism of these people is not as horrifying and monstrous as the way that European people figuratively cannibalize each other through war and exploitation and violence. He says, we may then well call them, the cannibals, barbarous in regard of reason's rules, but not in respect of us that exceed them in all kinds of barbarism. The real cannibalism was the cultures we extinguished along the way. If you want to read about colonial encounters and food and cannibalism, you have to read this book. Tasting Difference, Gitanjali Shahani. This book is fantastic. And actually in the description of this video, I'm going to link to a shoppable list of all of these books if you want to read more. I'm going to close out now with one final reference to an early modern play and accompanying critical perspective. The play is called The Sea Voyage, written by Fletcher and Massinger, first performed in 1622. And in one scene of this play, the sailors on their sea voyage are starving and have been shipwrecked in the company of an indigenous woman. The sailors start fantasizing and talking amongst themselves about the idea of eating her, wondering what she would taste like, whether they would need to season her with salt. And in his discussion of this play, and more broadly the significance of cannibalism on the early modern English stage, Matt Williamson says the following: that cannibalism on stage sometimes highlights the, quote, ostensibly civilized other, but more often than that, offers an exploration of what those who were ostensibly civilized could become, or even of what they might already be. Basically, that when audiences are confronted with the spectacle of cannibalism, they are forced to consider what might drive them to be able to engage in such acts, or whether the capacity to do such a thing is already within them. We'll call that food for thought.